So, my name is Nathaniel Kenner, and today I'm going to be talking about the criminalization of youth of color. The criminalization of youth of color happens for several reasons that we'll be going to in this video. Um, a lot of them are over policing of youth of color, um, institutionalized racism, including policies and procedures that are unfair or disadvantage youth of color. Labeling is also another uh, form of over policing that tends to happen more to youth of color, and how all of these things can lead to the school to prison pipeline, which is, in my eyes, part of the criminalization of these youth of color. So in my analysis, I found two different sources that I wanted to go over. The first was an article talking about the rate at which criminalization happens to these youth. Uh, it talked about the black-white gap, which is the difference between the amount of youth of color and the white youth are in the juvenile prison systems. And there's been a 15% increase in black criminalization versus white student criminalization. Um, in 2018, there were 750,000 new juvenile cases in California alone, and 35% involved Black youth, despite them only being 15% of the population here in California. This is a 233% increase versus the expected percentage of what it's supposed to be. It, and then I also looked at Victor Rios's book Punished, which looks at the troubles that both Latino and Black young boys have to overcome these institutional hurdles uh, in the education system. Some of these are pre-labeling or labeling, and that can look like, oh, that kid comes from a bad family, or that kid's just a troublemaker, or that boy, he just doesn't listen. Other institutional hurdles that they overcome is over slash under policing. So youth of color tend to be over policed, in which I like to imagine it kind of like helicopter parents, or they just have the eyes of the teachers, the principals on them more than what their white peers are looked at. And this can lead to criminal charges for minor infractions. In Victor Rios's book, he goes over several examples of how these youth of color were given criminal charges for what should have been minor infractions. And the final institutional hurdle is the school to prison pipeline. And that's where these youth, because they are over policed, because they're pre labeled, because they have all eyes on them, uh, these criminal charges that they end up getting placed upon them causes them to serve time in juvenile detention centers. And as we've seen in other sociology classes and other sociology books, once you are put into the prison system, you are more likely to return. And so that's why it's called the school to prison pipeline, because we're just setting up these kids to live their lives inside of the prison system. So I wanted to reflect on all of this analysis that I went into, and two of the most poignant stories I read from Rios's book. One, he talks about disturbing the peace instead of detention. And so in this example, he's talking to two young boys after school, and they're talking about how their principal is just this awful guy and he's unfair and this and that. And when he asks for examples from these boys, he said that he was given, he had the police called on him and he was charged with disturbing the peace, simply telling, simply for telling the principal to, uh, simply for mouthing off to the principal. And in this instance, it should have been a detention. That would have been a fair punishment for what had happened. But instead, he was charged with disturbing the peace. And this is an example of over policing or giving criminal charges for minor infractions. And it's really quite upsetting and unnerving that the principal of a school would be so willing to call the police on a child instead of just giving the child detention. Another really poignant story is Rios goes back to his hometown, and one of his friends, who was a couple years his junior, had recently been stabbed, and his friend was explaining to him that there were several detectives that came to the hospital while he was recovering, and they were trying to get him to admit that he was in a gang when in fact he wasn't. They were trying to label this stabbing as gang violence so they could just round everybody up and ship them off, charge them, not really care, not really do the due diligence that they have to do on these cases. And both of these stories kind of point back to Abrams' stats, the paper that I mentioned earlier, especially with that 233% increase versus what the expected percentage should have been. I I find it disheartening, to say the least, that there are these youth who are just simply for existing in these schools, they're over targeted to the point where they are charged, put into juvenile courts, when their white peers could do something extremely similar and not have these level of uh, not have this level of repercussions come down upon them. And I think what really needs to happen is we need to address these problems. We need to look at them and say, yes, this happens. This is something that we need to change. And then we need to implement said change. I think that part of the reason this happens, I know earlier in the semester we read about how there are these school campuses that have police officers assigned to them. And I just honestly think that when there is these institutions such as police forces, and there's a history of racism in the country, by perpetuating stereotypes, by um, watching the youth of color more than watching the white kids, or by handing out harsher punishments for these youth of color instead of sitting down and trying to help these youth grow, help them learn, help them develop. I think that's the major problem that's going on here that leads to the criminalization of these youth. And I would like to see some serious addressing of these problems, and um, some genuine solutions to them as well, because we can't keep destroying these kids' lives simply because we have biases, we have these policies that should no longer exist. And so, for my critical questions for this is, what policies in these school districts led to a 233% increase in criminalizations of youth of color? Why were the detectives trying to coerce Rios's friend that he was in a gang? What are some ways school districts can prevent the school to prison pipeline? And why are white youth underpoliced? And why are Black and Latino youth overpoliced? And then, just to sum it all up, these are my sources. I used Laura Abrams' paper, The Criminalization of Young Children, Overrepresentation of Black Youth in the Juvenile System. And for my second source, I used Victor Rios's book, Punished, Policing the Lives of Black and Latino Boys. And so I just wanted to thank you for watching my presentation, and have a great day.